All right. Good morning, everyone. Matt Braden here from the GPAR team. Welcome to Coffee Talk. Speaking of Coffee Talk, next week, Monday, we're going to have Councilman Derek Green with us for Coffee Talk. So we're going to kick the week off with him and lots of stuff to discuss about what's going on in the city as it relates to real estate, public safety, and those assessments that we've been talking about. You've been hearing about, the numbers are crazy. So we're going to talk to Councilmember Green about that, his views on it, and a whole host of other things. So hopefully you can join us Monday morning at, I think it's 8 o'clock. Emails have been going out, and we'll send out a couple more reminders about that before Monday. But let's get to today's Coffee Talk. Where's Jake at? President Jake, good morning.
Good morning, Matt. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And yeah, I'm excited for this one. We get some good insight. I'm here to welcome Dr. Jessica Lautz, Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights at the National Association of Realtors. The core of her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers. Jessica's been with us a handful of times over the last few years, and I'm very, happy to have her with us and to hear what's going on out there on a macro level. So, Jessica, thank you and good morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jake. And thank you, Matt, for having me back again. Yeah, I feel very lucky that I get to join your group a few times. So I compared and contrasted my slides to make sure they were new and fresh and good information. So I'll jump in and start sharing my screen and we'll zip through some slides, and feel free. I will have some questions towards the end too. So if anything that strikes you, feel free to keep it in mind, and we'll chat through it too. So it is a very interesting real estate market right now. Obviously, we are coming off of, I think, about 2 years of an incredibly hot market. So if we think 2 years ago, things were opening back up. I know Pennsylvania was one of the states that was really locked down from real estate activity the longest. But we knew that once it opened, it was essentially just a boomerang back to a lot of pent-up demand of people saying, I need to move. The pandemic has either forced this move, or it's time now, and I am busting at the seams in my house. Right now, we're facing higher interest rates. We essentially have a triple threat in the market today. So we see these rising interest rates that's impacting affordability, but buyers have also faced double-digit home price gains for an extended period of time now as well. At the exact same time, we have incredibly limited inventory, which is fueling those home price gains. So that's a very difficult environment for home buyers to jump into. It's hard for first-time home buyers. It's hard for minority buyers. And I'm going to go through some of that information and how it's impacting these young adults trying to enter in and have household formation. The big caveat that I'm going to give you right now is I'm going to give you some stats, and in about 30 minutes, they're all going to be wrong. Well, in 90 minutes, they're all going to be wrong because we're releasing our existing home sales data at 10 a.m. Eastern. So I'll give you these macro numbers and then wash them from your memory because they will be gone. So essentially, we are seeing near an all-time low of units right now for sale, low inventory in your area as well, about 2 months of supply on a national scale. In a healthy market, we would have 6.5 months. So when we think about this inventory that's slowly coming onto the market, we're seeing incremental gains. We have a long way to go before we have a balanced market. The other thing to keep in mind too is that these home price gains are happening on a double-digit pace. They're going to be sticky. It's going to be around for a little bit of time. So if you see buyers who are suddenly saying, I can't afford this market now, that's okay. There's another buyer on their heels who does have a higher income or perhaps wealth, whereas a repeat buyer and has had these gains in equity through time, or perhaps they're in a life situation where they just have to move. If you're getting a divorce, if you're getting married, if you have a growing family, if you're an empty nester and you really do want to relocate to be close to grandkids, that's an impetus to move regardless of interest rates. And perhaps those interest rates don't necessarily matter to you because you're paying all cash for a home as well. And so we do see a lot of all cash activity continually in this market. A month ago, when we released our latest existing home sales data, we saw that 28% of home buyers were actually paying all cash. So interest rates, that's not something that matters to them. We are seeing what we have the expectation is that yes, home price gains will slow, but it doesn't mean that home prices will go down. So that's a different environment than what we saw in 2008. I know there's been a lot of questions from real estate professionals, from realtors, from the industry of what's going to happen, and big questions about, is it a bubble? No. So what we're going to see is the slower demand, but home prices are going to continue to increase. So the current expectation from our chief economist, Dr. Lautz, is that home prices throughout the end of the year will increase 5%. So instead of these 15% increases, that's not necessarily a bad thing. For those home buyers who are really stretching, who are having a hard time joining and entering into home ownership, that might be an opportunity for them to be able to. And that's a healthier pace in this market that has been overheated and quite frenzied. I want to throw out a few reports here that I think are really helpful in thinking about this inventory crisis. If we think about the inventory crisis nationwide, we are short 4.5 to 6.5 million homes. I know that's a big wide range there, but essentially if we say we're short 5.5 million homes, we can land on that. And what we do see is that people want household formation. They want to find their own home. Young adults don't want to be doubling up forever. We did these reports because I think it's pretty helpful to think of outside the box ideas. We know that housing starts are going up. That's encouraging that housing starts are going up, but we know builders are continuing to face supply issues and actually having those housing starts be housing completions. So these reports are to think about existing structures and how they could be repurposed into actually residential units. So in your area, when you're talking with that council person next week for your next coffee talk, maybe it's not next week, the next coffee talk, then I would, urge to bring up some of these. Each community is different. Maybe you do have that vacant mall. Maybe you do have that vacant office building or that vacant retail mall. I know in our area, they're even converting vacant malls into residential units. And so these are case studies that you can use to really have action and to say, wow, this did work for this community. Maybe we can think about repurposing these vacant hotels, motels. New York Times had a great article on vacant motels, hotels all along the East Coast. I thought it was fantastic. If anyone wants Schitt's Creek, maybe I'm the only one, but I know it won some Emmys, so I can't be the only one out there. It's a great show, and I think it spurred all of this movement to repurposing these. All right, so let's talk about the ownership gap by race. I'm going to show you several maps here. This is from our latest research on our snapshot in race report. We talk a lot about the ownership gap when it comes to race and looking at this on a national scale. And I'm going to show you this graph here. This is really helpful in looking at what the trajectory has been for the last 15 years. And if we look at this data, what we can see is that actually the homeownership rate has increased during the pandemic. We know a lot of people were able to save money and a lot of people were able to jump into homeownership, and that demand was there and they really wanted to jump in. Unfortunately, what we can see here on this graph is that it did increase for every race except for Black African Americans in the US. So when we look at this, it's helpful to understand that this gap in race has actually widened over time. And what I think is really important here as well is to look at this on a state level, because that's where it really sheds some light on what's going on. So if we look at the white homeownership rate within the state of Pennsylvania, and we'll just do an apples to apples comparison here. I'm going to pick out North Dakota. Hopefully no one has relocated from North Dakota to the Philly area. Let's just compare these two states. We can also pick out California as well. We know affordability is such a crisis there. In some areas of the state, the median price for a home is $1.8 million. So obviously hard for everyone to enter into homeownership. So for white individuals within the state of California, 62% homeownership rate. If we then look at the Asian Pacific Islander homeownership rate, this month actually is Asian Pacific Islander month. And so if we look at that, what we can see is that the homeownership rate across the board drops. So in Pennsylvania, it drops to 59%, North Dakota to 20%, and in California to 61%. So affordability being a crunch there, but we do see it's a little bit higher. The next one that we'll jump to is the Hispanic Latino homeownership rate. And what we see here is in the state of Pennsylvania, it drops to 44%. So lower than what we do see on a national scale. North Dakota significantly lower than a national scale at 29%, and California at 46%. So lower than the national scale, but towards the higher spectrum of those three states at least. And then if we drop to the Black African-American homeownership rate, we're going to see drops here across the board. So in Pennsylvania, 43%, talking pretty close to the national scale, actually. So that's really quite good. If we look at North Dakota, 9%, and in California, 37%. So obviously some work to do in all of these states to close that homeownership rate gap, to bring that closer to the white homeownership rate so that we don't continue to have that spread. And of course, the bottom line here is those wealth gains that individuals have through homeownership is such a bolster for individuals and families' future to pass on to future generations and hopefully bring them into homeownership gains as well. And of course, the social benefits of housing that everyone here is well versed with as well. So I do want to go through some of the buyer demographics by race. I think this is really helpful in shedding some light in the experience of what successful home buyers, what their portrait looks like. And of course, this isn't reflective of everyone, but I do think it's helpful in taking a look at this. So when we look at home buyer demographics by race, what we can see are some pretty big differences here that do lead us into why we may have this continual gap in homeownership. So one of the things that we see here pretty quickly, and I'm going to go to the gray bar first because it's the tallest. So let's go to that one, is first-time home buyers. I've alluded to this already, but what I think is really interesting here is when we talk about first-time home buyers and the struggle they have, we really have to remember that they may want to be an FHA borrower. So 25% of first-time home buyers using an FHA loan, regardless of race. And when we look at this, what we can see is that it's more common for every minority group to be a first-time home buyer. So less likely to have that past home equity for that down payment and a harder time saving to get into homeownership because they may be facing rising rents of 30% in some areas. The other thing I think it's important to note too is that if you're an FHA borrower, USDA or VA loan, and you're up against an all cash buyer, you're just going to have such a hard time entering into homeownership because of just the competition out there. The other thing we see here is this blue bar, student loan debt, a huge hurdle for young adults today. The biggest hurdle that we see for successful home buyers, regardless of race, and holding them back into homeownership, it impacts the debt to income ratio, it impacts the ability to save, and that is a very large hurdle for individuals. The other one here, the green bar, single female buyer, we know that single women have a lower household income in comparison, especially to married couples, certainly, but also lower in comparison to individual males. And so if we see and compare apples to apples, it's just going to have a harder time entering into homeownership. We see a higher share of Black African-American buyers are both single female buyers and also have student loan debt and are first-time home buyers. So really just coupling all those things. On the next slide, what I want to show you here is down payment source. When we think about the down payment, it's easy for repeat buyers to pull that from the past equity in their home. But given the rise in home prices, we often see that repeat buyers are having to diversify where they're pulling that down payment from. So often they are pulling it from savings, even as a repeat buyer. What we're also seeing here is when we look at this by race, there's some pretty interesting things here. So one is that the 401k. We do see it is more common for Black African-American buyers to tap their 401k or their retirement savings to pull their down payment. And so when we look at that, what we know is that that could be some wealth erosion, certainly not with these double-digit home price gains. Certainly we know that housing is moving faster than the stock market, especially right now. But I do think it's important to know that if you're taking it out of retirement, you're not really taking it from other sources, right? So that's definitely I have to do this to actually enter homeownership. The other thing that we see here is that for Asian Pacific Islander home buyers, they are most likely out of all home buyers to actually rely on family help for their down payment. And then the other thing that we see here, of course, is that past equity. So all of these different sources coupling up, and it doesn't necessarily someone chose one versus the other. They could have chosen all of them to really enter into homeownership. The other thing that's incredibly important when we talk about race and home buying is that even when we look at successful home buyers, those who did purchase a home in the last year, what we see is that the rejection rate for mortgages is incredibly high among some individuals. So for Black African American buyers and Hispanic Latino buyers, 7% of successful home buyers, those who did purchase a home, were actually rejected from a mortgage in their application process. So they were savvy enough and they knew that they should be qualifying for a mortgage. And so they pressed forward. And what we do see is that the rejection rate for Asian home buyers and for white home buyers significantly lower. And this is something that academic studies have found as well, as this denial rate is often 2 to 1. That's very hard when we think about those home buyers who are turned away and said, you know what, I don't qualify, even though they have a perfectly high enough income, a low enough debt to income ratio that they should actually qualify to enter homeownership. They just say, no, I don't think I can. And they walk away from this buying process. And that becomes a very difficult proposition for those individuals. All right, I'm going to jump gears here. I'm moving into millennials, everyone's favorite topic. I know. First thing in the morning, talking about millennials. I know we're tired of it. But let's jump in. I want to show you why it's important to real estate, why when we talk about this inventory crisis, I don't think it's going away tomorrow. It's not going to go away overnight. It really is going to be a problem that's going to trail us for quite a while. When we look at the US population overall, so we're not looking at home buyers, we're not looking at any specific thing here, we're just looking at the US individuals. So when we look at this, what we can see is the green bar all the way from the left to with mortality rates. We're watching these older individuals, their bars are getting shorter here because there's less individuals who are hitting over the age of 90, over the age of 95, and so on. Smack dab in the middle of this chart, what we see is the millennial generation. This becomes very important because we can see just visually, it is bigger than any other generation in the US right now. We also can see that there's more of them than anyone else in the US. So it's more than the babies born in the last couple of years. It's also more than the older adults in the US, the silent generation. What becomes the most important here when we think about housing is actually this red bar. So the red bar is the median age of a first-time home buyer. It's 33 years old. If we look just beyond that, what we can see is that for 25 to 32-year-olds, that is the biggest population in the US right now. There's about 32 million young adults who are aging into what is typically a first-time home buyer age. That becomes very important when we think about the inventory crisis. It doesn't necessarily mean that these adults are mortgage ready. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can financially purchase a home. But what it does mean is that they want household formation. So maybe that is just renting a place. Maybe that is moving out of their parents' home. But these are young adults who are entering in. And this is what's really crunching inventory, both for rental units and for ownership. I'm going to take a sip of my own coffee. Sorry. All right. When we look at the median age of home buyers overall, what we can see here is a couple of things that I want to pull out. Very sorry. The median age of repeat buyers, when we look over time, has increased pretty dramatically from 36 years old in 1981 all the way to 56 years old today. Why does that matter? We know that people are living longer, they're working longer, they're feeling confident purchasing a primary residence at a later age. That becomes incredibly important when we also think about this inventory crisis, because we see people in the housing market and every generation of home buyers today wants to purchase a single family home. When we see this inventory crunch, this becomes incredibly important. We actually see that all of these individuals are competing for homes in the burbs. They're competing for single family residences. These older home buyers do have equity. These older home buyers do have the ability to purchase these homes, as we see these first-time home buyers struggling to get into the market. When we look at last year's data, what we do see is that first-time home buyers did have a slight uptick to 34%. This is not necessarily a surprise when you look at that population chart. The other thing that's really important when we look behind this data as well is that we know that there is more parental help today than there has been in the past. So if we see parents helping with that down payment, then we know that this is an easier road into homeownership if you don't have to save for that down payment, the closing costs, furnishing your home yourself. And so we see individuals entering in. 50% mark, that was the first time home buyer tax credit. It pushed a lot of buyers into the market. There was a lot of inventory at that time. And so it really did help. But since that time period, we have seen that first time home buyers have been under the historical norm. The historical norm is 40%. That 30% mark, this is important to point out at this time period, as we think about rising rates, we don't expect that rates are going to rise into double digits. That is not our expectation at all. But back when there was 30% first-time home buyers, we did see double-digit interest rates, and we also were in the midst of a recession. So a very, very different environment than what we have today. But that was the result of that, is just that plunge in first-time home buyers in the market. The other thing I want to pull out here is there's a lot of fodder about, that avocado toast meme that is so old at this point. It's not even from the US, it's from Australia. It's been co-opted by us. And one of the things that I want to pull out here is just the spending of young adults today in comparison to past generations at the exact same age. When we look at this, I think it's really interesting because we compare pretty quickly here younger millennials today under the age of 25 currently, compared to younger boomers at the exact same time period. What we can see is that younger millennials today are spending a disproportionate amount on housing. So 35% of their expenditure is going towards housing in comparison to 29% of younger boomers at the same age. We also see here that younger millennials are actually spending less on transportation. So maybe taking rideshare services, using public transportation, embracing that as opposed to purchasing their own car. The other thing that we are seeing here is that more is spent on education today than it had been in the past. So we know that college costs have gone up. We also know that there are a larger share of young millennials today, young adults today, who are going to college in comparison to past generations at the same age. So some differences here that are very, very easy to pull out. And if you just want to do the fun one there and you want to do food away from home, we actually know that food away from home is actually decreased. So the avocado toast meme, maybe they're making that avocado toast in their own kitchen of a rental unit or their parents' house, but they're not necessarily taking that out. The other thing that we know that young adults are getting a lot of grief on is living at home. I'm going to tell you, let's not give them a hard time. And the reason why I'm going to make this argument is that I think it could help them financially. We have seen a record share of 25 to 34-year-olds who have actually moved home during the pandemic. So we see this tick down last year, but we still see a lot of young adults at home in comparison to what we have in the past. Why I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing is that we do actually see a lot of young adults who are moving directly from their family member's home into homeownership. So perhaps they were still working at that time and they just popped their laptop off. They went to their childhood bedroom. So they didn't have to face that rising rent of a 30% increase. And in that, it gave them the opportunity to perhaps open their own door into homeownership. I'll say my little sister is in that generation too. So she's 28 years old, and the entire time during the pandemic, she lived with me in my basement. She paid me very minimal in rent. It barely covered her wine. And what we saw is that the week of Thanksgiving, she said, you know what, I'm moving into my own place. And it was pretty amazing. She bought her own place, and she was a single woman who made the sacrifices of moving in with me and being able to buy her own place for her dog and now her 2 cats. So she basically has a farm condo. So what we also see is that she is not unique. 21% of first-time home buyers did purchase their own property, but they moved directly from their family member's home into homeownership. So they skipped that rental proposition. That's a good thing for these young adults. That is very hard for you because these young adults have never searched for a rental unit, or at least not in the recent past. And so their expectations may not actually meet reality, but also all of the lifts of figuring out utility bills and all of those things are going to be very new for these first-time home buyers in comparison to someone who may be savvy as a repeat buyer or to a renter as well. The other big thing that I want to say here is down payment misconceptions are really widespread right now. I would really encourage you all to try and help dispel these myths, especially as we see these rising prices. It may be that a home buyer could enter home ownership and they may be able to do so sooner rather than they think. So when we look at this data, what we do see, 35% of consumers think that you need 16 to 20% down for a down payment, and 10% think that they need more than 20% down. That's a lot of individuals with some big misconceptions there. The other thing that we do see is when we look at first-time home buyers, what we see is their typical down payment was just 6 to 7% over the last few years. So it's been very, very flat. The highest it's ever been is in 1989 when it had 10%. It's just not common. So we just don't see that happening. Even among repeat buyers, they're not putting 20% down. They're putting 17% down in the last year for a down payment. So it's just not common. So shout it from the rooftops. These low down payment programs are available. People can enter home ownership on a lower down payment. And again, quarter of first-time home buyers taking advantage of FHA loans. And it is a possibility that if we see less buyer demand moving forward, perhaps these programs would be more common and that buyers would be more apt to use them because there's not going to be a dozen home buyers with contracts really ready to go with offers as opposed to what we had been seeing. So perhaps that fewer competition in the market could give the opportunity for first-time home buyers to use these programs. The last thing I want to say here is that with all these changes, both demographic changes, economic changes, changes in the housing market, agent use is very consistent. 87% of buyers using an agent in their home buying process. We do see that people want an agent. When we look at the youngest home buyers today, when we look at single women today, we see that those are both growing shares of home buyers in the market. 43% of the market is millennials. Of primary residence buyers, it's millennials. So we do see that they are making up a large segment of buyers. They're using agents at higher rates than anyone else. That's really important. When we look at sellers, 90% of sellers are using an agent to sell their home. We see that iBuyer services, it's less than 1%, and FSBOs is just 7%. So we really do see there's a lot of people who want an agent. They want someone to price their home competitively. They want someone to market their home. They want someone to be able to show them how to fix up my home for sale. And that's something that's very, very important to sellers today. All right, so I'm going to take a very large sip of coffee, but I'm happy to take any questions. But I would encourage you to follow us on social media as well. Everything is changing on a daily basis. We post new blog content every day, and we repost it on our social media. So thank you for following along, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So I think we're going to rename this from Coffee Talk to Avocado Toast Talk. That's too much. That's hard to say. But we did get a question in the chat, and I think Jake might have a question also or two after this. But it goes to the psychology of buyers. Will there be a shift in the psychology of buyers wishing for a single-family detached house and being willing to accept a multi-unit building? Any thoughts on that, Jessica?
Yeah, we have seen that every generation of buyers is actually looking for a single family home in the suburbs. So not a lot of variety there. It is actually the most common for older retirees to look for multifamily units. So looking for something that perhaps they don't have to do the upkeep, a condo, a townhouse, something along those lines. And also single women looking for smaller square footage and looking for those properties as well. So it is most common that even young millennials are looking in the burbs. And we actually see a higher share of millennials who are actually purchasing in small towns than we do see in urban city centers. So it's kind of a flip from that narrative that we've heard a lot of. But I think one of the things we have to keep in mind too is that urban city centers are quite expensive and inventory is really limited. So if you can get the ability to get into a home in a suburb, in an overlooked area, that's perhaps what these young adults are doing and where we're seeing that activity.
Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. I'm going to plug NAR Research. If you're not currently following NAR Research on social media, you should be. It's like great content. They're short, simple nuggets. It's really informative stuff. So it's really, really good stuff. I'm glad I'm following you guys on Instagram now. Going back to the demographics by race and looking, I mean, are there action steps there that like we can be aware of? Looking at the mortgage rate denial, right? Encouraging that denied borrower to give it another shot, maybe. But like, is there stuff there that we should be thinking about or can take away from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would plug a couple of resources. So one, absolutely having that list of mortgage lenders that are your go-tos, but also, that you feel comfortable with, and having that pretty substantial list. So in case that does happen, you can say, no, let's take another look at someone else. But I would also say the Fair Haven program, if you haven't taken that from NAR yet, it's free. It's really cool. It's a simulated program, and it kind of takes you through different things that could happen in a transaction that bring up fair housing issues. And you can go through that. All the staff at actually NAR went through that last year, and I think it's a pretty cool program that's now out there.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions coming in on the chat. How much do you think the population concentration of Blacks in cities/urban areas impacts home ownership?
Yeah, I think that's very, very possible that that's an impact. So we put out a report titled Double Trouble this year as well. And it looks at, as well as the snapshot on race and homeownership, the obstacles to homeownership. We put out 3 different reports this spring. One of the things that we looked at is looking at the disproportionate costs that's spent on rent versus income for Black households versus white households. So if you were a Black household, you were spending more on rent than white households out there in comparing both rent and income. And so that's going to have a really, really big impact in being able to save for a down payment on a home if you're spending all of that money. And when we're seeing rental costs increase so dramatically. So that absolutely could. And then again, looking at the lack of inventory in city centers, if you're wanting to stay in that city center, finding that available property could be quite hard as well.
Okay, here's another question coming in from the chat, and that is, what actions can be taken to increase home ownership in other races? I know NAR has been very much doing a deep dive on this stuff, putting out a bunch of resources and whatnot. So not only in the shop of what you and Lawrence do, it's going into other areas as well. So can you share anything with us on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. So one that I think is a very impressive program is called 3 by 30. So it's increasing 3 million new Black households to be homeowners by 2030. So a short time frame now. I know we're in 2022, but only 8 years from now, and looking at creating new homeowners. So not just repeat buyers who are buying a bigger home, but new homeowners in the market. And I think that that's a pretty encouraging program. So that looks pretty holistically at the market, looking at how the government can help with any particular programs, whether that's down payment programs, whether that's credit access. And it's a large coalition of different organizations. So including the Urban Institute is also partnered with that. The other thing that I think is really encouraging is that I gave you a lot of research, and research is research, but sometimes it's really important to get that into the hands of policymakers. These were among the talking points that were included for our legislative meetings a couple of weeks ago. And the other thing I think that was pretty impressive is that when we released the snapshot on race report, oftentimes research sits on a shelf I talk about it, but it sits on a shelf in all honesty. And I have to be realistic with that. When we released this report, the Secretary of HUD picked it up, or her staff picked it up, Secretary Fudge, and they actually released a statement and said, this is a report from NAR and we need to bridge that gap and lower the homeownership gap by race. And these are some actions that we can take. And that was something that happened at HUD. So I think that's pretty cool when your research is actually read at that level.
So just kind of dovetailing, and excuse me, I'm getting a frog in my throat. It's
Sorry.
It's contagious, coming up the whole East Coast. But just to dovetail on what Jessica was just saying, a few weeks ago, NAR had their annual meetings, and there were Hill visits. So there were visits to lawmakers from across the entire country. Obviously, they're all there. GPAR was doing its part. Heather Patron-Shook, Melody Zimmerman from our staff, they were making the visits, dropping off that information, those data points and talking points and all that kind of stuff like that. Bill Festa also is our contact with Representative Dwight Evans. So that message has been carried forward to the Congress people that represent us here in Philadelphia. So just kind of connecting some of those dots for all of you. I think you may have touched upon this earlier, Jessica, but going back to interest rates, changing, normalizing, in the chat, there's the question saying, with the rates normalizing, should we expect more price adjustments, less multiple bid situations? What's your read on that?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint the exact time. And I think every little neighborhood is going to be different across the country. But certainly we're already starting to see that. So if we think about even looking at the first of the year, in the dead of winter, we were seeing 4 to 5 offers for every home that's listed. We're certainly seeing that decline now. Still a multiple offer situation because we have such low inventory. So buyers who can jump into the market, they're feeling confident doing so. I think that if we look towards perhaps late summer, fall, it could be a more equalized market, but it's going to take a very long period of time to get that inventory into the market, because we know that it has historically taken 6 to 9 months to build a home once it goes from housing starts to housing complete, the family can move in. And it's just taking such a long period of time now for builders to make that happen. But we are going to see buyers who are jumping out of the market because they can't afford to purchase a home with these rising rates.
Okay, well, we know Jessica has a hard stop here. She's got another appointment after us. So I just want to say thank you very much, Jessica. You're going to be getting more emails from me in the future. We're going to have you back for sure. And for some of you who maybe jumped on a little bit later, we have this recorded and we will be posting it to our YouTube channel. So keep an eye out on your inbox. We'll put a reminder out there for everybody. So let's give a quick round of applause to Jessica and Jake for Coffee Talk today. Jake, any last thoughts?
Jessica, thank you again. Really appreciate your insight, and it's good stuff. People do follow your research, right? We are it's insightful and important, and appreciate what you do. And since Matt didn't do it, I'll plug it. License renewal is the end of the month, so if you haven't done your CE, you still have time, and make sure you renew your license.
All right, everybody. Have a great day. Take care. Go Phils, business person special this afternoon. All right. Take care.
Take care.